So welcome everyone to our 30-minute high impact change tool webinar this week. Theo Stiegler here for Nexus for Change. Our session last week was a thought leader keynote with Professor Michael Beer from Harvard Business School. And if you're interested in that, the link and details, link to the recording can be found on our blog at nexusforchange.com. And today we're here to talk a little bit about some of the basics of event evaluation. So have you ever struggled to get constructive feedback on an event that you're holding, and it seemed like lots of energy and effort was looking to go into designing a survey, and you weren't exactly clear what to ask for and then how to leverage that data that you would be receiving, if that's the case? Let's get some background on that. To create impactful event evaluation is challenging because a lot of times decisions that are made as to how the event has to unfold are not made clear to evaluators all the time. There often tends to be a disconnect between the people that sponsor the event, those that are asked to implement, facilitators, and then your participants that might be attending. And a lot of times there's sort of an ambiguity of the purpose of why you're attending, particularly with situations where there's some sort of mandatory requirement for participants to be there. A great tool, not so shameless plug, to resolve some of those issues up front is to leverage design teams. And there is a webinar that we held on design teams that you can certainly review. And I'll put the link for that into our chat. And again, you're welcome to review all those resources on our blog. Another challenge is to figure out whether or not you're asking for real-time feedback on the event engagement that you're leveraging, or whether you are going to ask for feedback after the fact. A lot of times asking for real-time feedback can be received by participants as a distraction. It might be perceived as, well, that's inconveniencing me. I was really trying to focus on this. Now you're asking me to evaluate. A lot of times it is difficult to fit it into a spot because you tend to want to do evaluation toward the end of the event. Where do you do it so it doesn't sort of break with the flow of the event? So you have to balance that with, on the other side, the reality that if you don't ask for feedback in real time at the event, if you wait for after to ask for mail-in, email feedback or anything of that sort, you get a clear drop-off in participation in that evaluation. We typically see at least a quarter, sometimes as much as half or worse, depending on the audience. And again, depending on whether or not they had to be there or were volunteers in how they decided to attend the event in question. So why do we typically evaluate? A lot of times we're looking for maybe the adaptation of a process or an activity. You're looking for continuous improvement in the kinds of event that you're hosting and holding. You're likely trying to predict the effectiveness of a future event similar to the one that you're engaging. And a lot of times you're trying to find out, well, was the purpose of our event achieved? For example, for a training event, you want to find out whether the participants actually learned the things that you were training on. So typically overall, one might say that an intention of evaluation is to predict and or guarantee more robust outcomes the next time around. So if that's the case, let's figure out what a robust means in the first place. The definition that you would find on Wikipedia or in some dictionaries is something along the lines of a process that is impactful even if only a percentage, a part of the process requirements are met. And typically the more robust your process is, the lower the required percentage of sort of the ideal condition needs to be. In order to get to robust outcomes, a lot of times it's sort of, if we're looking at that from the evaluation angle, we really need to start on the other end and start with robust and evidence-based tools in collaborative practice. Another plug would be for you to look at the Collaborative Change library that we look to leverage here at Nexus for Change. A lot of tools and practices are featured there. For example, Change Days is a practice for 1 to 3 day engagements that was recently featured in Forbes magazine. Toronto Change Days in 2020 is, Forbes called it one of the 5 conferences that any entrepreneur should really go to around the world and have on their radar. So there's a lot of tools available that are evidence-based and will help you with that robustness from the start. Typically, there are 2 competing demands for evaluation. And if you're wondering what those are and why they're in competition, it's these two. It's whether or not you're trying to improve the events that you're holding or whether you're trying to prove the effectiveness of something that it is that you're doing. Now, why is that the case? Why are these two in competing? Why are they competing demands? If you look at the consideration, what makes robust evaluation? We like to think of a framework here at Nexus that we leverage where we're looking at 5 levels of evaluation. And those actually are a combination of Kirkpatrick's 4 levels of evaluation that sort of come from training and development and return on investment from Phillips. And when you combine those and you look at reaction and satisfaction as level 1, number 2, learning, the third one, change behavior in your participants, in this case for event evaluation, outcomes and results, and finally, return on investment for you and your organization, you get to a pretty complex set of things that you would go after in leveraging different evaluation tools. So when you're looking to improve an event that you're holding, you would focus on the first 3. You would look at what is the satisfaction with the event engagement amongst my participants, what is the learning that they're taking away, and what is the potential behavior impact, behavior changes that can be found. If you're looking to prove the effectiveness, you need to start at level 3 and look at change behaviors. You need to look at results and outcomes and return on investment. Those tend to be more difficult to get and gather data on than satisfaction data. So why are we saying simple best? We have found that any evaluation that you're leveraging for an event that is longer than a page or takes a certain time amount is usually met with some resistance. The numbers here that I'm sharing with you on the screen are percentages from customer feedback surveys, but I would suggest that for event evaluation, you get some similar considerations. I don't have time for surveys. I find this inconvenient. You're asking me too many personal questions I don't want to share. The survey is too long. You'll get all those kind of responses. In addition to, as mentioned earlier, if you're waiting till after the event, typically you get at least a 25% drop off, and only a maximum of 75% of your participants will give you any sort of feedback. And a lot of times, the longer you wait, and depending on the audience, a lot of times your feedback responses drop to 50 or below, percentage-wise, that is. So an effective evaluation tool needs to be simple. When we do event evaluation, we also like to think of it as part of a larger evaluation framework. Rarely is it really effective to just look at an event and say, that's the only thing I'm looking at, that's the only thing I'm evaluating. Usually an event that you're leveraging for your organization is part of a bigger strategic effort that you're maybe engaged in. Maybe it's part of a training effort. So really want to think of what that whole is and then hone in on what your event specifically is going after and what it is looking to provide in terms of outcomes. And the second piece is that we suggest that to do event evaluation focused on improving if you're going after participation from your entire group of participants in that event. Specifically then, if we're looking at improving what it is that you're doing, looking at satisfaction, level 1 of the 5 levels of evaluation I shared, and level 2, the learning. So what might that look like? We suggest that in order to really have a meaningful indicator of your participant satisfaction, that you don't just ask about satisfaction, but what is likely the best indicator of their satisfaction is really here in number 3. Would you come back? Would you return? Would you participate in this kind of event or a similar event again in the future? A lot of times we find that if you ask somebody, were you satisfied? They'll say, yes, I was very satisfied. But would you recommend it? That tends to be a maybe. And would you return? I'm not sure. So just because you're asking them, were they satisfied? It's probably not going to give you the whole picture. You really want to ask all 3 of these. Were you satisfied with the event? Would you recommend it to somebody else? And would you come back? That will give you a much bigger, a much better picture, quantitatively speaking, of folks' satisfaction level. Secondly, if you want qualitative actionable data, what was it that actually you were satisfied or dissatisfied with? What we found is a really good way to ask is to say, what should we start doing? What should we stop doing? What should we continue doing? That framing tends to give people a quick and easy way to jot down a couple of notes that can be impactful for you as a facilitator or as the planning team or as the design team to turn around and take those suggestions into your next event's design. The second piece that is looking more at the learning component, the level 2, is to find out what was most helpful and what was least helpful. Again, those have both a feature that allows you as an event planner, as a facilitator, to potentially react or leverage that data that you're getting. And it also gives you some insight as to what the learning was for your event participants. The example that I have, our Great Lakes Exchange is a quarterly event that we have here at Nexus locally in Northwest Ohio. And we try to make sure that we provide an evaluation opportunity for our participants to give us some feedback. And if you look at the 10 questions that are here, you'll recognize the most helpful and least helpful. And you'll recognize on the bottom the start, stop, and continue doing. Sorry, my screen is appears to be a bit laggy. And if you look at the top here, question 2 is about the satisfaction. Question 3 is the recommendation. And 4 is, would you attend a similar event again? Some of the other questions are more specific to sort of the logistics and the circumstances of the event. If you had food, then that makes sense to ask about. We always want some feedback on our registration process and the like. The environment of the room, I'm going here from the bottom up, the setting and the lighting, were they conductive, were they helpful? And we tend to try to include a question that asks for feedback on whether our purpose for the event has been achieved. For the design sessions, really what we're trying to do is, yes, we're trying to design the exchange event on the following day, on the Saturday, on our Friday evening design session. But we're also really trying to give people more comfort and more familiarity with the design process, which for us is summed up in the 3 questions for collaborative event design. There's another webinar on that you can find on our blog. But those 3 questions are, what's the purpose of the gathering tomorrow in this case? Who needs to be present and what conversations need to be held? That is the framing that we use for our design sessions. And so we ask for feedback on that as well. Another one that is always helpful as an indicator for potential follow-up, did you get what you needed today? And depending on how people answer that and the rest of their responses, we always ask here at the bottom if we can follow up with you, what's your email? That's a really great question to sort of allow for a first step into that conversation. If I do choose to follow up with a participant, hey, so I saw that you enjoyed the event, you indicated that you would maybe even recommend it, but you said you didn't need, you didn't get what you needed in our session. Tell me more about that. Or if they say, yes, I got what I needed, then that's another opening to, hey, what was that? What specifically? And maybe you can build on the most helpful response here. Similarly, for the Saturday event, which is a larger group than on Saturday, where we gather and we do sort of a learning by doing experience of using the collaborative approaches that are featured in the Collaborative Change library. And again, you can kind of see the first set of questions about the overall event, then questions about purpose and outcomes, the environment, the facilitation, and again, in the top here in the overall, you'll recognize satisfied, recommend, and would you return? And then again, our least and most helpful, and the start, stop, and continue doing. I can provide these templates to you all if you would like. Certainly happy to include those. This will be in my follow-up email to you. And you can utilize these as you see fit. A second example, so obviously those 2 examples are for in-person gatherings on site. A lot of the virtual video conferencing tools that are out there, including Zoom, the platform that we're on right now, have some built-in features that you can use for feedback in real time at your sessions. At the end of this one, for example, you'll see just a little thumbs up, thumbs down, sort of voting request that you don't have to indicate, but that Zoom will ask you if you give the sessions a thumbs up, thumbs down. That gives me as the host and facilitator just a simple, okay, of the people that attended, a third set, it was great, 2/3 set, not so great. I probably need to figure out why that was. And again, that gives me an opportunity for follow-up. I will also in a minute here open the poll that is a built-in tool into Zoom. And it will ask you about our session today, and we'll ask you those same questions. I'll do that after I share a couple more tips and resources here in a moment. But that will pop up on your screen, and we'll ask you 3 questions, and you might take a guess as to what those are going to be. Zoom does not allow for text answers, so I can't ask an open-ended question in this particular tool to say, you know, what did you find most helpful? That one would have to be a separate follow-up. But you can use like a multiple choice kind of questionnaire within this Zoom environment. So lastly, what we found is that it's important that you make event evaluation part of your agenda at the event, even if it's toward the end, that you make sure that you manage your time and that you provide an opportunity for folks to complete an event evaluation, and that it's not, and I'm sometimes guilty of this, but when it is something where people are already heading for their coats and trying to head out, you're not going to get A, the quality, and B, the participation that you need to be most impactful. Secondly, provide both virtual and on paper pencil tools for completion of your evaluation tools at events. While a lot of folks have phones and tablets and things available where they will leverage those to complete an evaluation, there's plenty of folks who still prefer a piece of paper in hand to complete. And finally, keep it to one page, just the sort of the message that you're handing out an evaluation tool. And if it's multiple pages or front and back, a lot of folks will just put it down and say, I don't have time for this. If it's one page, you tend to get a more meaningful response. If you're interested in all the background information as to how we look at and why we try to leverage evaluation tools, there's an article here that I will share with you in the chat. You might recognize, some of you, the lead author, Dr. Katie, who is the founder of Nexus for Change. But this is basically looking at integrating Kirkpatrick's 4 levels of evaluation that I shared, and Philip's model for return of investment into the 5 levels of evaluation that we leverage and use here at Nexus. And so before we hop into our Q&A, I'm going to open up the poll here in Zoom, and we'll ask you 3 questions. And I would love if you could, in real time, give me some feedback on those. And again, I encourage you to, when you host webinars, virtual sessions, to leverage these tools. This is what it looks like in Zoom. There are, I know that, for example, in GoToMeeting, GoToWebinar, in that platform, there are some similar tools. I am not sure off the top of my head with some of the other ones, but most have some basic built-in feedback mechanisms that you can leverage and utilize. All right, so thank you for that. And I'm going to then open the floor for any questions that you might have.
Some of it is familiar. It's a good reminder for me, especially Kirkpatrick's.
Okay.
As my former life, I was a trainer and instructional designer.
Gotcha.
So I had flashbacks there.
That makes sense.
Yeah, so it's a good, really, really good reminder. I appreciate it. And I think I have to get better at that whole evaluation, the tangible evaluation.
Yeah.
Because I get the anecdotal, because I usually work with smaller groups because they're executive teams.
Yeah, so one of the challenges that we didn't talk a lot about is sort of that balance between qualitative data and quantitative data. Mm-hmm. You know, a lot of times you get really good nuggets in sort of the qualitative questions that you're asking. For example, that start, stop, continue is something that I've really found to be effective, where I can get good nuggets that I can sort of implement the next time around, and or then go after feedback and say, hey, that was really interesting. That surprised me that you wanted us to continue doing this particular piece, you know, tell me more about that. but it doesn't give you, if you're trying to, from the standpoint of an evaluator saying, here's why my evaluation was meaningful, or if as a facilitator, you're trying to leverage a data piece to say, hey, this many folks said it was successful, people tend to latch on to, you know, those percentages of saying, well, we had 60% say that they would come back. That's really good. And then you have numbers too that you can compare sort of with, you know, the typical averages that one might get, that you can research for different kinds of events and compare and say, hey, you might think 60% saying they're coming back is not that great, but actually in comparison to, here's an example, here's another example,
Right.
that's really good. You know, those kinds of conversations I think are helpful to have that quantitative data piece for as well.
No, you're right. I like having both because it feels like a checks and balances to me, because people may be saying one thing maybe in a survey, and then I do the intentional dialogues like a cafe, and then that's data.
Right.
That's coming out. And so to be able to have all of that, the qualitative and the quantitative, I think is really powerful.
No, I agree. Yeah. And it's, I think it's always helpful, even for the, what you might think of as dry, quantitative data, to be able to have supporting pieces from, you know, engagements, from recordings, from longer responses kind of thing is really helpful, I think, in when you have to write reports and, or share with, you know, the next team up or the next folks looking to leverage that kind of process to explain it.
And using it, I found is using it too as a baseline, either a baseline or a benchmark.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And so, do you know what I mean? Going all the way through, so we know how far we've come. I found that valuable because of the type of work that I do. So it's a longer term.
Oh, certainly. Being able to have
that middle section where it's hard. And people forget how far they've come.
Right, absolutely. I mean? Yeah, and so that quantitative data gives you a really meaningful entry point. It's simply, well, let me look where I was with my satisfaction scores a year ago, 2 years ago with the same kind of engagement. Absolutely. Yeah. So that's in my thinking, that's a big part of why I don't think of event evaluation and in and to itself. It's always part of a larger, what's the context, what's the frame. And yes, if I have similar events, maybe every quarter, maybe just once a year, but to be able to go back and have consistency in the data that you're asking for, so that you can make comparisons and draw inferences based on, well, this year we changed this particular piece, and does that have something to do with the fact that we had 10 more people saying they would, 10% more people saying that they would return versus a previous year? Absolutely.
That makes sense.
All right, well, that gets us right to our 11:30 mark, and I want to honor our time here this morning. Quick plug for our sponsors: the Bowling Green State University doctorate in organization development and change. The first cohort is underway. We will not have a webinar next week for Christmas. I think we all need to and deserve to sit home and spend time with our families. But there will be one upcoming the first week of January, and that will be in your respective email inboxes and our social media. And so thank you for being here today, and have a fantastic holiday season.